Hey there, 7th grade. This is a video that tells you a little bit about your study guide for your Middle Ages test. So here are things you need to know for your Middle Ages test. You need to know the hierarchy in feudalism, the king at the top, the nobles, knights, peasants, which are also called serfs. You need to be able to label that. You also need to know the process of how a person became a knight, squire, page, etc., dubbing ceremony where they swear allegiance to Christ, or that they could be knighted on the battlefield for doing something good or heroic by the king. You have to know what life was like for a serf. What did they do? What was their purpose? Why were there serfs? Meaning, how did there become so many serfs in all of feudal Europe? Explain it. And why were serfs so important in Europe? We went over serfs did everything. They farmed. They built objects. They were the blacksmiths. They were the ones who did the work that allowed the manors and allowed the castles and allowed the kings and the nobles and the knights. They gave them everything. So when you read about life as a serf, go through that part. And also, why did Europe fall to feudalism? Remember, the fall of the Roman Empire created many different little kingdoms because you didn't have the Roman army guarding and guiding all of those areas conquered in North Africa, Asia, and Europe. So they fell because when the barbarians attacked, after that, there wasn't any way for the Roman military to protect. And so all of these little itty bitty kingdoms popped out. And these little itty bitty kingdoms that popped out were then run by, a king and then knights. What was life like on a manor? Be able to explain a little bit about what life was like on a manor. And then also, what was life like in a castle? Be able to explain a little bit about what life was like in a castle. You need to know the 7 sacraments. And also, you should be able to provide an example of how one of these sacraments is similar to a practice in Judaism. Remember, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, matrimony, holy orders, penance, and extreme unction. All you need to do is be able to list the 7 sacraments, but you should be able to explain one of these sacraments and then compare it to Judaism. So baptism, right? Entering the mikvah. Confirmation, becoming a bar or bat mitzvah. Matrimony, getting married and signing a ketubah. Confessions to a priest, penance, like Yom Kippur, when you are asking for forgiveness. Extreme unction, the being blessed before you die, the mourner's kaddish, the Misha Berach, etc. Also, what was the purpose of the Crusades? We know the purpose of the Crusades they were religious wars fought over Jerusalem, the Holy Land. The kings of Europe and the Pope believed that the land of Palestine, the land of Eretz Yisrael, and that Jerusalem was the holy capital. It's where Jesus was crucified. And Jesus lived in Bethlehem and Nazareth in Israel. And so this land needed to be taken back from the Muslims for Christianity. The Muslims believed that Jerusalem was also the place where Muhammad ascended into heaven. It's where the Dome of the Rock mosque is. And so the Muslims, the Seljuk Turks, who were Muslims, believed that Jerusalem was holy to them, and they needed to protect Jerusalem. Illuminated manuscripts. What was the purpose? We know that they were a book that had images drawn in them to explain illustrations of the people, or to the people as well. So remember, these are the comic book kind of looking objects where there were images about the Bible, religious practices, life in Europe, and these were to provide stories to those that were illiterate. So it was easy for those who were illiterate in Europe to look at the images and learn about the history of the church and the history of the Bible, and to provide a way of kind of like a basic education to the illiterate. How is Joan of Arc a martyr, someone who dies for their cause or dies for religious reasons, and an unusual leader of France? Remember, she was just a teenage farm girl. and she had these powers that she believed were spoken to by God. She was able to lead these men into army and defeat English fighters in the 100 Years' War. She was also able to, what she said, speak to God, but really it was her conscience telling her what to do. And then we also see that she was able to identify who King Charles really was, being able to go through a church and point out who the real king was, even though the real king was dressed in regular people's clothing, which is pretty impressive. All right, this is kind of the hardest one. You need to be able to provide two similarities of medieval Europe and medieval Japan. This question will have a reading prompt that you will have to read before you answer the question. Much of the reading prompt will come from this section of your document. This is the section that is after the coat of after the coat of arms project part of your Google Doc. That's the Middle Ages. So you should read through this very briefly, and you should be able to see how medieval Europe and medieval Japan are the same. Remember, medieval or feudal simply means very old-fashioned or primitive. And so you're going to have to be able to come up with at least two ways that you can explain how medieval Europe, the Middle Ages in Europe, was the same as medieval Japan. And so here's a pyramid just to give you an idea. You had the kings and queens of Europe. You had the shogun of Japan. You had the lords and ladies of Europe. You had the daimyo of Japan. You had knights in Europe. You had the samurai of Japan. And then you had the serfs and peasants of Europe. And the same, the merchants, the artisans, people that make goods, and the peasants in Japan. So you might want to be able to draw out or write out this feudal hierarchy. Also tells you who these people are. The daimyo, those who owned the land of the lords, who then gave the land to other people. Samurai, the warriors who defended the empire. So again, this kind of gives you an idea of the feudal hierarchy in Japan. This also gives you the feudal hierarchy of Japan with the samurai society, emperor, shogun, daimyo, and samurai and peasants. There's a short little flick here on the samurai. It's pretty cool. It's like a 5-minute video that shows you what life was like as a samurai. And it tells you right here a little bit about what the samurai did. Talks about the armor the samurai wore. Interestingly enough, very similar to those of the knights in the Middle Ages. Culture of the samurai. The tea ceremony of the samurai, which is actually pretty similar to the dubbing ceremony of how one became a knight. And then also, women in samurai society. Nakano Taketo, a woman warrior. One who literally was a woman warrior who, like Joan of Arc, was a samurai who led Japan in fighting. And then Tomogo Zen, the history of a samurai, a woman warrior who fought for Japan. So this is an easy-ish kind of way you read through it. You should be able to compare and be able to explain two similarities of medieval Europe and medieval Japan. And again, there will be a little paragraph about medieval Japan that you will then have to pull from that and then explain, compare, contrast, explain similarities between the two. Again, this is your study guide for the Middle Ages test. Magically, some of the questions from the study guide will end up on the test. The test will be on Thursday, September 29th. For all 7th grade social studies classes. Hope you enjoyed this.